Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Franz Kafka's short story, actually not the front of it, A Report to an Academy. So this is a short story written in 1917, and it was published, I believe, first in a journal called Berjude. And so there is good reason to see this as a sort of parable of the Jewish experience in modern European history, because so Kafka himself was Jewish, and so that makes a lot of sense. It was published in a Jewish-oriented magazine or journal or whatever it is. And much of the sort of thematics of the play deal with. So I sort of read this in two different ways. One is a sort of assimilationist component of a diasporic experience, and one of the things that marks our experience as Jews is that we are a diasporic people. And we have been since the second destruction of the temple. And even the modern state of Israel, I think, does not fundamentally alter that, particularly since many of us are not particularly keen on the state of Israel and its political and humanitarian, we'll say, record. But we are a diasporic people. There's also a very strong postcolonial reading here, which I don't think is, I don't think those are mutually exclusive. I think they actually reinforce one another. So the premise of A Report to an Academy is that we have a character named Red Peter, who is an ape. And I mean like an ape, like a. He doesn't specify specifically, but there was a performing ape at the time named Peter, and so Red Peter does distinguish himself from Peter. He says, "I'm Red Peter, not that Peter," right? And that Peter was a chimpanzee, so it is potentially a reasonable supposition to think of Red Peter as a chimpanzee. But again, Kafka is not specific. And the reason that I say that is because we as human beings are in fact apes, right? So when Red Peter makes the distinction between apes and humans, it's actually scientifically kind of a false division, right? We are great apes. That is a scientific reality, according to the classificatory systems of biology, whatever it is, right? But Red Peter has learned to behave as a human through imitating humans, and he has worked basically as a sort of sideshow act, vaudeville act, whatever it is, right? He has graced the stages of Europe and made quite a good living for himself. And now he has come to this academy, and what he says here at the opening is, "Honored members of the Academy, you have done me the honor of inviting me to give your Academy an account of the life I formerly led as an ape. I regret that I cannot comply with your requests to the extent you desire. It is now nearly 5 years since I was an ape, a short span of time, perhaps according to the calendar, but an infinitely long time to gallop through at full speed as I have done, more or less accompanied by excellent mentors, good advice, applause, orchestral music, and yet essentially alone, since all my escorters kept well off the course so as not to spoil the picture. I could never have achieved what I have done had I been stubbornly set on clinging to my origins, to the remembrances of my youth. In fact, to give up being stubborn was the supreme commitment I laid upon myself. Free ape as I was, I submitted myself to that yoke. In revenge, however, my memory of the past has closed the door against me more and more. I could have returned at first, had human beings allowed it, through an archway as wide as the span of heaven over the earth, but as I spurred myself on in my forced career, the opening narrowed and shrank behind me. I felt more comfortable in the world of men and fitted it better. The strong wind that blew after me out of my past began to slacken. Today it is only a gentle puff of air that plays around my heels, and the opening in the distance through which it comes and through which I once came myself has grown so small that, even if my strength and my willpower sufficed to me to get back to it, I should have to scrape the very skin from my body to crawl through. To put it plainly, much as I like expressing myself in images, to put it plainly, your life as apes, gentlemen, insofar as something of that kind lies behind you, cannot be further removed from you than mine is from me. Yet everyone on earth feels a tickling at the heels, the small chimpanzee and the great Achilles alike. So I guess from that we can read that as an implicit assertion that Red Peter is a chimpanzee, but it's not stated definitely. So, on the one hand, this is very much, I think, a Jewish story, right? In the vast majority of societies that have some sort of ethnic enemy or minority or villainized group, animal imagery is typically used to depict them. African Americans in the United States during the period, the colonial period, slave period, antebellum period, through the Jim Crow era, very common monkey and ape imagery used to dehumanize African Americans. In Britain and the United States, anti-Irish racism often depicted Irish people as apes or gorillas again. And in Eastern Europe, Central Europe, various forms of anti-Jewish prejudice took the form of animal imagery. Nazi propaganda, for instance, often depicted Jews as rats, often depicted us in these very bestial ways. And apes or monkeys is not an unheard of comparison for Jews either, right? You think about a film like Cabaret. There's a famous number in which the MC dances with a person in a gorilla costume. And the big joke at the end is, if you could see her through my eyes, she wouldn't look Jewish at all. Right? So we've got all of these things. And so the idea that Red Peter has sort of transcended his identity as an ape is an interesting one, because Kafka, I believe Kafka's family was quite an assimilated Jewish family within Prague society. And this was very common for Eastern European Jews, Central European Jews, especially in major urban centers. They would very often be culturally identical to their Gentile neighbors, with the exceptions of the things that they needed to do to maintain their Jewish faith, right? So not eating pork, not eating shellfish, going to synagogues rather than churches, etc., right? Observing the high holy days. Yeah. And so there is that sort of sense of a lost identity. But there's also these elements of post-colonialism decades prior to the ways in which post-colonial theorists would conceptualize the impact of colonialism on colonized subjects. Although I'm sure that many, many, many people in, say, British, French, Spanish, German, Dutch, etc. colonies had intuitions of this, but it's not until the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and 70s that you really get a substantial amount of postcolonial theorization. And so I think Kafka anticipates some of these things in interesting ways. So at one point, Red Peter says, "Of course, what I felt then as an ape, I can represent now only in human terms, and therefore I misrepresent it. But although I cannot reach back to the truth of the old ape tradition, there's no doubt that it lies somewhere in the direction I've indicated." Now, this one to me is a really interesting one because it seems to align with what Ngugi wa Thiong'o talks about in Decolonizing the Mind, one of the most famous and influential post-colonial texts. What Ngugi talks about in that is the idea that the imposition of, for him, because he's Kenyan, the imposition of British culture, the English language, British literature, and European classics, etc., a Europeanized or British approach to education functioned as a cultural bomb. And that's his term. That it is meant to destroy the connection between and alienate the colonized subject, make the colonized subject's own native culture strange to them, while imposing an alien culture that is privileged as culturally superior, right? And so the idea that Ngugi really puts forward is that this education system that teaches the colonized person to speak another culture's language, to read another culture's literature, to behave with another culture's manners, that alienates the colonized subject from themselves, their true identity, which is rooted in their culture, in their background, their language, etc., etc. And there's a sort of potential for essentialism here, but I don't think Ngugi is an essentialist in this way. And again, very much is about a sense that the society and the culture into which one is born has cultural norms that are encoded in things like language, encoded in things like behavior, morality, ways of looking at the world, etc., etc. And having a different culture imposed on you alienates one from that, right? And so this is, of course, one of the major components of the modern Jewish identity, is as Jews assimilated to German culture or Austrian culture or Czech culture, Bohemian culture, Polish culture, Romanian culture, whatever it is, right? As Jews, especially upper class Jews who lived in sort of cities and were engaged in high society, whatever it is, as they assimilated into those cultures, they were alienated from their identities as Jews. And Red Peter has gone through the same thing. At the same time, we have these elements that are representative of another major post-colonial theorist's thought, that of Homi Bhabha. So one thing that Red Peter says is that a lofty goal faintly dawned on me. He's talking at this point about being on the ship, being brought over to Europe, and he was in this very tiny, compressed cage. He says, "A lofty goal faintly dawned on me. No one promised me that if I became like them, the bars of my cage would be taken away. Such promises for apparently impossible contingencies are not given. But if one achieves the impossible, the promises appear later retrospectively precisely where one had looked in vain for them before. Now these men in themselves had no great attraction for me. Had I been devoted to the aforementioned idea of freedom, I should certainly have preferred the deep sea to the way out that suggested itself in the heavy faces of these men." And he later says, I repeat, there was no attraction for me in imitating human beings. I imitated them because I needed a way out, and for no other reason. And even that triumph of mine did not achieve much. I lost my human voice again at once. This is a specific incident that occurred. It did not come back for months. My aversion for the schnapps bottle returned again with even greater force, but the line I was to follow had in any case been decided once and for all. And so one of the things that Homi Bhabha talks about is colonial mimicry, right? This idea that the colonized subject mimics the colonizer. And this works on a couple of different sort of fronts. One is in a similar way to what Ngugi talks about, right? A colonized subject is encouraged to behave like an English person or a French person or a Dutch person or whatever it is, right? They are encouraged to speak the metropolitan language. They are encouraged to adopt the customs, to read the literature, etc., right? And so there is that aspect to it. And this is done for preferment within the colonial system, right? If you, as, say, an Indian person or a Nigerian person or a black South African or whatever it is, learn to speak English properly, learn to read and write, learn to do math, you can get a civil service job. And you can be better off than if you were not able to get that civil service job. Better off in a material sense. And Ngugi obviously would disagree about whether or not you would be better off in a cultural and sort of existential sense. And I think Homi Bhabha would probably disagree with that as well. But on a material level of living a comfortable life, earning more money, having access to more resources, more social privileges, yes, absolutely. So that's one element, right? At the same time, there is an inherent limitation to this. Bhabha says that no matter how good your imitation, you will never be British, you will never be French, you will never be Dutch, you will never be whatever that metropolitan colonial culture is, right? And so there is inherently a gap there, right? The Indian can imitate an Englishman, but an Indian man can never be an Englishman in this formulation, right? The sort of contempt, maybe we're changing that sense, right? In the latter portion of the 20th and into the 21st century, as people of color from different backgrounds, et cetera, get incorporated into British and French and German and Dutch and whatever society. Maybe that's changing. And it's contentiously changing if it is changing. But this is sort of the post-colonial premise, right? Is no matter how much as a Black Jamaican you behave properly as an English person, you will still be a Black Jamaican, and you will never be an English person in the eyes of other English people, right? So there's inherently this limitation to it. At the same time, for Bhabha, the mimicry of a colonial subject is an indictment of the colonizing culture. It points back to the colonizing culture and says, look at what you do. Look how I mock you, right? Because this is a component of mockery, right? There's a little sort of like, you're doing this. Well, look how fancy I am. Ha, ha, ha. Such a ridiculous charade of cultural superiority, right? And so we see that as well in A Report to an Academy. There's this sense that Red Peter, in imitating the behaviors of human beings, even becoming so embedded in those imitations that he could not go back to being an ape if he so desired, or could not go back to the behavior of being an ape if he so desired, that he is an indictment of those human behaviors. And again, Kafka writes this in 1917. I think Ngugi's book comes out in the 60s. Homi Bhabha's, I think, comes out in the 70s. Yeah, it's super, super cool. Kafka anticipated these elements of post-colonial theory by decades. And again, maybe that's because the Jewish experience, the modern Jewish experience in Europe, is one of diaspora, is one of cultural alienation. And so maybe as Jews we should do more to make common cause, and many of us do. There's a huge liberal Jewish tradition, the prophetic tradition honoring and foregrounding justice and social equity. But yeah, I mean, there's a foundation in the Jewish experience for privileging social justice and anti-colonialism.